Well, welcome to the North Bay Science Discovery Day virtual event. This is the first time we could meet virtually because of the COVID. We couldn't be together in person as we have done in the past. But it's been a fun day for me, and I'm sure, and I hope it is for all of you. So let's look at the rules on the left side of your screen that says, please rename yourself on your application to the first name only. Keep your video off and stay muted unless you're asked to unmute, and use the chat box to ask questions or you raise your hand to be called on. And so this is about meeting scientists from the University of California at Davis and hear what their lives are like and what their work is. So, and we're going to hear from Mary, Mrittika, and Jessica today. So go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, so hello everyone. We are from Science Says. That's a group over at Davis made up of grad students and postdoctoral researchers. So basically we're all scientists that are excited about talking about science. So that's why we're very glad to be here today. We're going to use the chat feature. So as we introduce ourselves, please type any questions you have for us into the chat feature, and then I will read them and then ask you to unmute yourself and ask them, or ask the panelists myself. If you're feeling shy, that's totally fine. So go ahead and start thinking of the questions you have for us and start putting them in the chat. To introduce myself first, my name is Mary Madera. I am a strawberry flavor researcher at UC Davis. I am a third year. And so basically what I do is these are all at the top of the screen. You can see different kinds of strawberries, and I mash those up into smoothies. And then I identify what makes them smell and taste differently. And then the breeding program as a whole can use that information to make strawberry varieties that are good for growers. That means that they're healthy, they resist disease, they have they have really big berries, but then also that they taste really good for consumers like all of you. So that's my work.
Hi, I'm Mrittika, and this is a representation of the research I do. So I am a chemist. I study inorganic chemistry, and that is mostly the chemistry of stuff that contains metals, and it's usually those metals that make them brightly colored. So my specialty is making compounds out of metals that are typically very unstable, but I make them stable by growing them into these crystals, and they're all bright and shiny, and then I can shine X-rays on those crystals and figure out what's inside of them by using those X-rays. So that's what I do on any given day.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica. You can call me Jess for short. So in lieu of a slide, I actually made a Zoom background here, which basically kind of showcases the research that I'm doing. So I am a third year UC Davis PhD student in microbiology, which basically just means I study very tiny critters, very tiny, so tiny that you can really only see them with a microscope, or yeah, like a microscope. So I like to study plant diseases because little do some people know, plants actually do get sick. And while plants can't like cough, they can't sneeze like humans can, they can get really sick, and they can get all yellowy on this side and get dark, and they don't grow fruit, and they're just really sad. So plants can get sick. And the one thing that I'm trying to study is I'm trying to study how microbes, those tiny creatures that are in the environment that you can't see except for under the microscope, cause diseases in plants, and how the plant can defend themselves against the microbes. It's this two-way street that is really hard to disentangle, and I'm trying to solve that. And yeah, you can ask me about anything related to plants, or related to microbes, or related to drawing, I guess, if you're really interested in art. That's all I have to say.
Awesome, thanks. So we already have one question, and it says, are we going to meet real scientists? And the answer is yes. You just met 3 very real scientists. All 3 of us, even though our titles are student, we are all what it's called graduate students. We are all real life scientists. We do science and experiments, and we write papers, and we are doing new research every single day. Yes, yay, very exciting. So yes, nice to virtually meet you all. We are all scientists. And then the person who asked that, Sumedha, sorry if I mispronounced the name, your hand is raised. Do you have a question for us you'd like to ask, or was that the question?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Can scientists, how long do normally scientists take to discover something?
That's a good question. Who wants to start on that one?
I guess I can start. So, it's a really big range. And sometimes if you're in the life sciences, it depends on how fast your organism can grow. So if you're studying tomatoes or citrus plants like I do, it can take months or years for 1 or 2 plants to grow. And then it just takes a lot of time for your research. Like it can take several years even to come up with one new discovery because it just takes so long for the plants to grow. And sometimes I work with microbes, the small critters that grow overnight. You can grow them from nothing to a really dense broth full of the critters overnight. And with that, you can discover something new maybe in a couple years or so, but it still takes a long time because you got to do a bunch of experiments and make sure that you have that your answer is very much sound and that you have a lot of evidence to prove your point. So I would say it takes a long time. It depends, really.
On the other side of that, right, it does take a long time, but I don't know if you know what something called penicillin is, but penicillin is something that's called an antibiotic, and it's something that you can take if you're sick, and it helps treat you. And that was discovered. It wasn't established, like Jess said, it had to be tested for many, many years to make sure that it was safe for humans to take as medicine, but it was discovered on accident. I don't remember the full story, but a scientist, he had mold growing on a plate, and there was a certain area where no mold was growing, and that was how he discovered it. So you could say that it took him 10 seconds to maybe a day for the mold to not grow, for him to discover something groundbreaking. But then, as Jess said, it took many years to make sure that that was real and true and explain it as scientists do, and then turn that into medicine. So discoveries can happen very quickly and on accident, but to make sure that it's real takes sometimes years. And that's why lots and lots of scientists all work together to make lots of discoveries at one time. Mrittika, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I pretty much agree with you guys. When we discover things in my field of research, we usually make new molecules. And making a new molecule can be difficult because the reason it's new is because it's been hard to make so far. So a lot of planning has to go into trying to make a new molecule sometimes, but then sometimes all your plans fail and you end up with a different molecule, which is just as exciting. So discoveries happen in various ways and they're always fun.
I actually got a question that was sent to me privately from Soren. What are different types of plant diseases? That's a very good question. And I will tell you, there are a ton. And types really depends on what you're studying. So if you're studying based on the microbe that's infecting them, so is it a virus? Is it a bacteria? Is it a worm? All those things can infect plants and they can cause all different types of diseases. So some diseases will cause yellowing on the plant leaves. So if you ever see yellow stripes or spots or just this nasty looking color on the leaves, that's a different type of disease. And then there are also diseases that cause the plant to die in certain areas. So they turn all brown and they start wilting. That's another type of disease. And then there are also other diseases that you don't notice right away, where they get into the roots and they cause the roots to just rot. And you don't see it right away because it's underneath the soil. But all of a sudden, if your roots are gone, then the plant can't get the nutrients from the soil and the plant just starts to collapse in general. So it really depends on the type of microbe you're looking for. So there are just so many different types of plant diseases. And also there are some that affect the plant after you pick the fruit. I have a friend who studies post-harvest disease. So even after you take the lemon off of the tree, it can still get infected and turn moldy and gross. And that also counts as a plant disease because you're infecting a plant. That's a very good question.
So if you're joining us, several of you just joined, welcome in. Jessica, me, I'm Mary, and Mrittika, we are all scientists at UC Davis. We're all graduate students. Please ask us your questions. This is completely open-ended. Please type them into the chat or type them to one of us in particular, and we are happy to answer your questions. I guess a good one that we've had so far is what do you really love about science and about your job as a scientist? Mrittika, how about you go ahead and start us off with
Yeah,
that one?
I'll go ahead and start us off. Well, this might sound frivolous, but I really committed to studying chemistry when I was 14, when I saw something known as ammonium dichromate blow up. And when it did, it changed from orange to green. And that in my mind was the best thing in the world. Is like something changed colors, shot sparks in the air and just blew up. I have to figure out what's going on behind it. And what I've really loved is I get to work with things that change color, grow into beautiful crystals, and occasionally blow up, which I'm not going to say is a good thing. But everything that was exciting to me when I was 14 is equally exciting to me right now, except I can understand the underlying principles behind why it's working the way that it is. And pretty much that's what gets me into the lab every day is I get to see something turn pink or orange or blue, and I know exactly why it did that.
That's really amazing. I don't think my explanation is as explosive or as colorful as yours, but I think the thing that brings me to lab every day that really motivates me is the fact that because I'm working on a plant disease, I really hope that the things that I'm discovering and I'm learning about them really help change the way we do agriculture. So we all grow our food, we all eat vegetables, and as much as you hate vegetables, you eat them anyway, right? They're healthy for you. They're good for you. Fruits are delicious. I love strawberries. But the fact of the matter is there's so many diseases out there that affect them, and there's so many things we don't know about them. So I think that the reason why I really enjoy this field is because I get to discover something that could potentially help people, help us grow more food so that we can use our resources well, and that we don't have to spray a bunch of pesticides everywhere or use all sorts of things to try and change the environment so that we can prevent these diseases.
Yeah, and I'm very much in the middle too, right? Just like Jess is saying, I work on strawberry and I work on the flavor side of strawberry. And, I work on that because I think it's important that the food that we eat that is nutritious for us tastes good. But that food also has to be profitable. It has to make money for the farmers. It has to grow well. It has to be healthy from diseases. And so my colleagues work on those aspects. And so together as a group, we're making strawberries that are healthy and profitable and tasty. And I got into science, though, for reasons that Mrittika said, is that I like understanding how things work. For the longest time, I thought I'd be a marine biologist because I was full of questions. I wanted to know, what was that in the tide pool? What was that? How does that work? Why does the tide come in? All these things. And so what's driven my science journey is, what do I keep having more questions about? And that ended up, marine biology, I ended up not having as many questions. And I ended up having a ton of questions about plant biology and about cooking and about food science. And so that's how I decided to go into this field now, is what do I have burning questions about that aren't getting answered? That's why I became a scientist. I'm learning to answer those questions, and I'm surrounding myself with people who can answer those questions when I can't answer those questions. And that's a great segue. I think I just answered it, but I'll let the other two answer it. Whitney asked, what made you want to be a scientist? So I think I just answered that. It was getting to answer the answers to all of my questions and getting to work in nature and things like that. I'm really passionate about it. I get to do it all the time. I love working with my hands. So Mrittika and Jessica, what made you want to become a scientist?
Well, I sort of already gave away the whole explosion obsession thing. But other than that, I was maybe between the ages of 12 and 14, like Mary, I had a lot of questions about the way things worked, and not a lot of answers were given to me at that stage. The answers were more of words that were limited to a textbook, but I didn't feel like I was quite seeing the reason behind a lot of things that were happening in the world around me. Like, on a really hot day when you're driving, the road looks like it's wet from a distance, but it goes away when you come close to it. What was that? I didn't know when I was 12 and I really wanted to. So I guess at some point I figured out that the best way to answer all the questions I had was to study so hard that I would be able to answer them myself. And then all of that was like really focused on the whole pretty colors and things blowing up aspect of things. So that kind of helped streamline me towards the inorganic stuff.
I would say I hinted at this earlier, but I've always really enjoyed wanting to help people. And being in the life sciences, you can really sort of see the ways that you can make that happen. How I decided I wanted to be a scientist in this field was because I also found out that these microbes, these tiny little microscopic things, are the reasons why there's so many different things that are happening in our atmosphere even. I mentioned this before, not earlier, but earlier today, that microbes in general in the soil can basically change the composition of the atmosphere very slowly, but they can, and they can change it very drastically. So what made me want to become a scientist is trying to combine this desire to help people, to use my knowledge for good, but also to figure out like what's happening in the world. Why do we experience the things that the things that are happening? What makes the world go? So I think combining those two together makes me really want to be in this position right now. Oh, so by the way, there was another question posed to me earlier from Samantha, and they asked, is bacteria also a virus? And no, bacteria aren't viruses. They're actually shaped pretty differently. They are both very, very small organisms, but I drew a little bit here. So this right here is more of what a virus is shaped like. It's more geometric. It's more shaped like a cube or a dice or something like that. More geometric. Bacteria, on the other hand, are more like little pills, little round. They're either pill shaped or round, and sometimes they have tails. Viruses can have tails, but not a lot of them do. So bacteria are more round, viruses are more geometric, and viruses are also way more tiny than bacteria. They're so tiny you can't really see them with a light microscope. You have to go even deeper.
Awesome. So we had a question from Kai. First, Kai, I'm going to address your strawberry question, and then if you would like to unmute, I will let you ask your other question to us. But you asked me if I mutate the strawberries. Now, mutate is an interesting word in science because what mutate means, if you don't know, it means to change. And biology is based on lots of natural mutations. So cells in your body are naturally changing the DNA or the blueprints or the instructions that tell your skin to be skin and your hair to be hair. Those are changing as we sit here. That's happening. That's part of biology. And so I am not mutating the strawberries. They are sometimes mutating themselves. There's also a part of science, you might be a little older, you might know this, where it's called genetic engineering or things like that. That is something that I have done in the past, but not on anything anyone would eat. But it is safe. And so to answer your question, I do not mutate the strawberries. I could, if I wanted to, for science, I could do that. I could purposefully change some of the DNA to test certain things. But my line of work, I'm just testing what's out there already and smelling them and finding that. And so I am not mutating strawberries. And so Kai, you don't have to, but would you like to unmute and ask the other question you had?
What are the risks you'd face in your field?
Jess, do you want to start with that one, risks?
Yeah, sure. So seeing as I've worked with a plant disease, you may think like, it's not a big deal. They don't infect bacteria and viruses don't infect people if they infect plants only, right? The thing is, sometimes you work with a disease that if it spreads into the area, it could devastate like the nearby agricultural industry. So one of the diseases that I study is a citrus disease. And it's been spreading all throughout the United States through these insects. They're transmitted by insects. So we do work with some of those insects in the lab. And while we really try our best to contain them, but if they were to escape and infect nearby trees, that would be really devastating because I wouldn't want that disease to get outside and infect someone else's crops. That would be devastating. Luckily, it's not super spread in Northern California. It's mostly prevalent in Florida and Texas, but we don't want it to spread in California. So we really want to try and contain everything. That's the biggest risk for me, at least.
Yeah, I can go next. So I work in an inorganic chemistry lab, and that is about as scary as all the different kinds of chemistries go. So the biggest risks I face on a day-to-day basis is just everything. Whatever you can think of in terms of scary chemicals, I work with it. There's acids that burn you. There's a class of compounds known as pyrophores that catch fire if you expose them to air. So we have to work with them on these specially designed glove boxes where the atmosphere inside is artificially controlled to contain no oxygen because the oxygen is what makes them catch fire. I work with radiation because I do a lot of X-ray diffraction. This is how I figure out what molecules I've made. And there are some radiation hazards associated with that. We work with large quantities of solvents, which if you inhale, you could pass out. So pretty much all of the things that you would think are scary about a chemistry lab, I work with on a daily basis.
Mine is similar, but not as intense. I do some lab work. So I do some field work, and then I smash up the strawberries and I mix them with salt and water, which is very safe. But I also do some things in the lab that are dangerous. However, they are not dangerous day to day because there are lots of rules and regulations and measures that we take to make sure that I am always safe. I am never worried about going into my lab and doing an experiment because I know that I wear gloves. I know that I wear clothing that covers my skin. I work in a special device called a fume hood that takes toxic things far away from my nose. I wear masks and goggles when I need to. And I know before I start what the dangers are of all the chemicals that I'm working with. And so even though we do face risk, and I would say the riskiest part of our job is running these experiments that have these chemicals and these things you wouldn't find in your homes. But because we are scientists, we have been trained and we have safety people and the government makes laws that we have to follow. And so I think Mrittika would probably agree. We feel safe when we go into lab because we make sure that we are safe. So I would say there is risk, but we mitigate it pretty well. And so I think day to day, our jobs, Mrittika's is probably more risky than my job, but I think she's probably very safe because she's on the UC Davis campus. So that was a good question. Sumedha, you had your hand up again. Did you have another question for us?
She sent me a private question, so thank
perfect.
you for that. I can address it. The question is, what experiments do you do? Great question. So there are two kinds of experiments I do on a daily basis because I have two specialties, if you will. One of them is working with something known as a buckyball. It is essentially a spherical, I suppose, football shaped. No, in this country, it would be called soccer. A soccer ball shaped molecule made out of carbon. So it's a big round ball of carbon. And I try to put things inside of it. So I do chemical reactions that would make a hole in the football or soccer ball and let me place things inside it. And the reason I want to do that is because it would be a good way to trap a magnetic substance inside a relatively safe coating. So if you were to go get an MRI right now, they would probably use something known as a contrast agent. And that is a metal which is so magnetic that it sort of adjusts the way your body surrounding that metal, that region of your body, would respond to the magnetic field when they put you inside an MRI machine. Now, the way they do it right now is they straight up inject you with a gadolinium compound, which is not great for the human body. So what we're trying to do is take a big ball and then cut a hole in it and stick that gadolinium inside and stitch it back up. So now your metal is just as useful as it used to be, but it's now sort of covered in something that prevents it from harming your body. That's one of the experiments I do. The other experiment I do is trying to capture free radicals in the form of these bright colored crystals I showed you guys earlier. So that's another really fun experiment I do.
Thank you.
Mrittika, I had an MRI done like a few years back, so that kind of I'm really looking forward to see how your research goes, because I really don't like that infusion. It was really uncomfortable. I had a couple questions that were sent to me, so I'm just gonna go over them really quick. So, can microscopic things grow? From Whitney, and that's a very interesting question. And I guess it depends on how you frame it. Growing as in getting bigger than microscopic? Not really. They'll always stay like roughly around the same size, but they can make tons and tons and tons of copies of themselves. So you can grow from one cell, one tiny little critter, to millions and millions and millions overnight. So they can't really get bigger. They'll never get more than just a tiny little pill, but there'll be millions of them. Another way to answer that is, I think one interesting thing is that they can make things grow. So plants that are infected with some bacteria will grow a mass of cells on their tree. If you've ever seen a tree that has a strange lump on it, that's caused by a bacterial disease. That bacteria made that tree grow a giant lump. So the bacteria didn't grow, but it made more copies of itself and then caused the tree to make this mass on it. So it's pretty, I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about that happening to me for sure. And the other question that someone asked was, what is the most common disease? And that's a very interesting question as well. And I'm gonna assume, unless if you want to unmute yourself, Soren. I don't know if you mean like plant disease or human disease. I'm gonna assume plants because that's my field. Is that what you meant? Sorry?
Plant disease.
Okay, most common plant disease. I mean, I don't really know how to answer that question actually, because all plants, every single plant that you know of can be infected by something. Common it really depends on the environment you live in. Some, like for example, the citrus disease that I work on is very common to Florida and Texas because the temperatures there are really great for the insect host, which means that they can populate really well. Southern California can get this disease, but it's not really as prevalent because the insect doesn't really grow so well. So common is a very nuanced, strange, difficult word to describe. That is a very good question.
What about botrytis? Does that not count because it's on dead stuff?
I mean, I guess that is pretty common, like bread molds and stuff.
Bread
Yeah,
mold,
I guess
yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty common too. I mean, common is such a hard word to say because it's like, yeah, you could, I haven't dealt with a lot of bread molds lately. That is a really good question though.
I got a question privately, which I think is great. Soren asked, what is the most explosive chemical? So that's a great question. Well, there are a couple. So first of all, I think the chemicals so there's all kinds of explosive chemicals, some that are actually used as explosives. So TNT, for instance, trinitrotoluene. Fun fact, they let me make that my freshman year for some reason. Could go horribly wrong, but you have to be careful and safe, like Mary said. We follow regulations. So that's pretty explosive, and that is used as an explosive. But a lot of the explosives that you can think of, like TNT or RDX, I don't know if you have heard of it, or C4, those are stuff that are explosive when we trigger it. and stable otherwise, which is why they are commercially used as explosives. But I think the most freaky ones are the ones where you don't even have to do anything. If you just look at it funny, it explodes. So one of my favorite explosives, I wouldn't say favorite, one of the explosives I'm most fascinated with is this chemical called azidoazide. I'm just gonna type that into chat in case anyone wants to look at it. This is so freakishly explosive that even if you keep it isolated in a cold, dark room with no source of heat or light and no contact with anybody, it can still explode. It just does not want to exist. So it finds a way to stop existing.
So what is that used for? Why would that be in a lab?
It isn't used for anything because it's one of those species that like got made in a sort of a, so if you supply enough energy to atoms, they will make unlikely molecules. So I guess that was one of those situations where an unlikely thing that should not exist was accidentally created in a high energy experiment. And then it just simply does not want to exist long enough for people to even study its properties. So no uses, it just is a freak of nature, I guess.
Kai asked a question. Kai, would you like to unmute and ask your question? You don't have to, I can also read it. Okay. So Kai asked, what are examples of other plants that are under attack from diseases? I can answer this, but I'll throw it to Jess first.
Well, basically anything can be under attack from diseases. You've got rice blast disease, you've got the citrus greening disease, you got tomato bushy stunt virus, you got all sorts of things. And this is just off the top of my head. I think one of the really cool things about these diseases is that they really cause some strange symptoms. And I'll tell you a little story. So not only can plants that you eat get diseases, you can also have them attack, like some diseases attack flowers. So there's this one disease, a viral disease called tulip breaking virus, and I'll send the Wikipedia page for it. And basically it causes these really interesting patterns to show up on the tulip that apparently sold for they made really expensive flowers because people really like the symptoms of it. And I'll send them in the chat. They have really interesting photos. But yeah, people would deliberately infect tulips with this virus because it made really cool patterns on the flowers. And that's also a type of disease too. But I mean, it doesn't affect your food. So it's just cool to look at.
And a cool thing, if you don't know that much about plants, or I mean, I didn't know that much about plants until college, because they didn't I didn't learn it. So if you don't think about plants like we think about plants, right? We talk about disease. And again, Jess knows more about this than I do. But if you think about humans, when you get sick, right? Maybe you breathe in a germ or a bacteria or a virus from someone else, like coronavirus, that's how it works. And then it enters your bloodstream, and your bloodstream circulates throughout your entire body. If you think about a plant, it's got roots in the ground, and then it's got maybe a stalk or maybe a trunk, and then it's got branches and leaves, and then fruits and flowers and all these things. And it doesn't have a blood or a circulatory system in the sense that we do. And so that's why disease research gets really interesting, because it's like maybe there's a bacteria on a leaf that's making a leaf look red. And maybe the roots of that same plant are battling a viral infection in the soil or a fungal infection in the soil. That can happen too. And then a lot of people, I think, in Jess's field are trying to understand how that works. Like how does the plant deal with that? Does it drop the leaf? Does it lose the root? We can't lose an arm when our arm gets sick, but maybe a plant could to deal with the disease on its leaf. And so there's a lot that we don't know, and they're very different. There's a lot that we do know. They have a form of a circulatory system. That's how they get water from the ground all the way up to their leaves. They have a system that can do that, but they don't have, white blood cells like humans do to fight infection. And so I think that's why disease is such a broad term. Was that right? Did I get it right?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I would just add to that by saying, like, plant cells are very unique in that every cell in the plant's body is responsible for defending against diseases. So how in humans we've got red blood cells, white blood cells, macrophages, T cells, B cells, the whole battery of cells. Plants don't have that. Plants, every single cell is like, on guard, being like, all right, I got to find this pathogen. I got to find it and then figure out what to do. And yeah, plants are capable of saying like, oh no, this arm is infected. I just got to just lose it now. And it does make it really hard for people when like, you're growing plants in a greenhouse and suddenly your plants look really sick. You have to like you have to trim those dead leaves off because like the plant does spend energy to basically lop off limbs of it. And I think that's, I don't want to think about that. But it's interesting.
Are
also
all microbes bad?
do you really want to go into that today? I guess it's really that becomes a question of like environmental factors. The whole package goes into it. I'm not an expert in this field because I mostly study ones that definitively cause disease, but there are some cases where a bacteria that's in the soil that's like just chilling in the roots is not doing anything bad until something happens, like drought happens or not drought, or a big rain season happens, and then the bacteria says, oh, it's time to attack, and then just attacks the roots. So it's way more complicated than just disease and not disease. Sometimes they just chill.
But the simple answer is no, right?
No.
There's bacteria in our bodies and on our skin and your gut, you have bacteria. All of us have a bunch of microbes in our bodies that are helping us digest the food that you ate today. So just because we're talking about microbes that are harmful, because that's what Jessica researches, don't think that every fungus is bad, because as she said, it matters on the environment. Fungus that breaks down a dead tree is a good fungus, but if it's breaking down a tree that you want to stay alive, then you could call it a bad fungus. Microbes in our gut are helping us digest food, but if you get something called E. coli poisoning, that's a bad microbe, but it makes you really sick. So it gets kind of complicated, but don't be afraid of all microbes. Some are very good.
Yeah, I would like to add that I am a huge fan of yogurt, which is made with the help of microbes, and it's delicious. So they do some very useful things.
We had another question that says, do plants go extinct? Yes, they do. Everything can go extinct. I don't know how much detail you want on it, but I don't know how often it happens. Maybe someone else does, but yes, plants go extinct. Animals can go, just like animals go extinct. If they don't have, if the environment changes or another plant takes over and it just grows better, it's very possible for that plant to eventually stop existing altogether.
I do have one little story about this. One little known fact about bananas is that bananas did almost actually go extinct. There was a big banana virus that was infecting. I can't remember how long this was ago. I'm very bad at dates. This is why I'm not a history major. I'm sorry. But basically, almost all the banana plants were infected with this virus, and they were trying to figure out so long why all these banana trees were dying when you plant them. And then the whole industry was on the brink of collapse before they decided, like, hey, wait a second. We can clone a gene into the plant to make it fight off against this virus. So they made new banana plants with this new gene. And then all of a sudden, all the banana plants were okay. So thank some genetic engineering for why we still have bananas this day and age. But also bananas don't taste the same way as they did back then. So that's also different. I got another question from the DM, and it's from Soren. Soren, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question?
Do you study kelp and do about kelp or destroying the kelp habitat?
I don't really study kelp, but I guess I'm really curious. What is this? Do you where have you heard about this loss of kelp habitat along the California coast?
I heard about it from the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
And it's because of a disease?
Yes.
Whoa,
So.
I guess, that's really strange. I I don't know a lot about, unfortunately, all the plant diseases I study are from plants that grow in soil, so not quite in aquatic systems. That's all like a totally different field that I'm unfortunately not an expert in. But oh, that's really interesting. I should look that up. Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. I also got another question privately from Isabel. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, or do you want me to just say it out loud? That's okay, I'll just say it. What causes a plant disease? So there, again, it can be kind of a nuanced question depending on what type of disease you're asking about. But one way that one big thing that causes plant diseases are microbes. So for example, some of these little critters that I've drawn here, these microscopic creatures over here, like fungi, worms, like nematodes, those are worms, viruses, fungi, bacteria, insects, all of those cause plant diseases by either damaging the plant physically or by getting into the plant and making the plant or stealing resources from the plant or infecting the plant and causing it to die, stuff like that. Other things that can cause plant diseases are things like drought, so not watering your plants also counts as a plant disease, or not having enough nutrients in the soil also can cause plant disease. So there's a lot of what we call biotic, so the living critters like bacteria, fungi, nematodes that cause diseases. There are also abiotic factors like nutrients and drought and other factors that aren't necessarily from living beings. So there are two sides to this. That's a very interesting question, though.
Here's a fun question. And again, sometimes you have to think about it. So keep writing your questions. We have about 10 more minutes left in this session. And the question is, what is your favorite experiment to do or experiment and discovery historically? Like I mentioned penicillin earlier. That one's a pretty cool one.
I can go. This is not an experiment that I was responsible for. It existed before me, but it's something that I found so fascinating that I just keep doing from time to time, which is making Prussian blue. Now, if you don't know what Prussian blue is, it is a paint. It is an intense, almost teal and a mixture of teal and royal blue, sort of. It's a very rich color. There's a lot of paintings going back a long time that use it as a pigment. Famous paintings, even from, I think Van Gogh used Prussian blue liberally. And it's a beautiful pigment. And it was, for a long time, no one knew what it was made of or what its exact structure was. And when I was in high school, I got to make Prussian blue for the first time. And it is very dramatic because you mix two things that are not very colored. And when they combine, it makes this brilliant, rich blue color. And you can see the pigment starts to fall out of the mixture immediately. So while that's not my experiment, I have made it a couple times in various labs. And it's actually also used as an antidote for thallium poisoning. It's a good idea to have some at hand always in case you're working with thallium, which you shouldn't be. But if you were, you should have the antidote. That would be my favorite experiment, the synthesis of Prussian blue.
I'm going to talk about one of my favorite microbes that exists. It's this bacteria called Deinococcus radiodurans, and I'll put a link to it in the chat so you can check it out too. But basically, it was a bacteria discovered after basically trying to sterilize meat with UV radiation. They were like, if we're going to make this meat really clean by just zapping it with UV radiation and just clearing any little microbes on it, and it'll be perfectly clean, right? Turns out, after using the UV radiation, that meat still spoiled. And the scientists were like, why? And they found that the thing that was growing on the meat was this bacteria called Deinococcus radiodurans. And it turns out that it actually is a bacteria that can survive tons and tons and tons of radiation, higher than what a normal human can go through. And the reason why is that it carries multiple copies of genetic information inside of its tiny little body. Like it's tiny, like imagine printing out several copies of your homework, and then when you try and turn it in, all these people along the way are just trying to tear up your homework. You have multiple copies, so it doesn't matter. You still have one copy that works, so you can still turn it in at the end of the day. This is basically what this organism does. And I think it's really interesting that, like, no matter what we try and do to keep microbes off our food and keep microbes off our everything, something still manages to grow. Nature finds a way somehow. And I'm just going to put this in the chat so you can check it out on your own.
Yeah, mine isn't historical. Something that I actually really like doing in the lab, I do it all the time, is I extract the DNA and the RNA. So, right, the DNA is like the instructions for the cells in the organism that tells them what to be. And the RNA makes that happen essentially. And if you know the word gene, or you know what genetics is, it's all based on understanding and being able to read those instructions. And so I do that a lot because I do a lot of work in genetics, and I need to know what genes and what proteins are being expressed in these different organisms and in the strawberries. And it's funny, and I bring it up also because if we were in person and in past years, we've actually done DNA extractions with you. So I'm going to leave a link there. If you're interested, you can do it at home. And so my favorite experiment to do is DNA and RNA extractions. Are there any other questions you guys have in your direct messages? Does anyone want to unmute and ask us a question? Nope. So we've got tulip breaking virus in the chat. We have Prussian blue in the chat. We have the Deinococcus radiodurans in the chat if you're interested. And then we also up above have our website if you're interested in that.
If there are no more questions, I think we can end this session.
Sure. No one has questions?